Hello and welcome to another edition of Spotlight. European countries are experiencing a wave of strikes and protests due to high energy prices, an unprecedented rise in living costs, and, of course, combined with poor pay and working conditions, as well as other government policies. For instance, in France, an increase in retirement age. In this edition of Spotlight, we will try to shed light on the reasons behind Europe's economic woes and also discuss its ramifications. In order to do that, we're joined by Shabbir Razvi, economic and political analyst, who's joining us from London, and Mr. John Bosnitch, journalist, activist, and political analyst, joining us live from Belgrade. Thank you very much to both of you, gentlemen, for joining us. Let's begin with our guest from London, Mr. Razvi. Recent months have been marked with a significant upsurge in industrial action in the UK, Germany, France, Spain, Portugal, just to name a few. And observers are saying that the widespread strikes are likely to continue. What, in your opinion, is the underlying cause?
Hello, good evening. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Look, it's quite a complex issue, but at the same time, it's also quite simple to understand and analyze. What we've had in Europe is since the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, when in the United Kingdom and in Europe, austerity measures have been applied in a quite a vicious manner, whereby incomes have been reduced quite significantly, and the former economic minister of Greece, Yanis Varoufakis, of the sort of current banking crisis that is facing Europe and America, said that it is absolutely impossible to stabilize a banking system which has been built, designed almost to be unstable. I would go really as far as to say that the whole capitalist system is impossible to stabilize, and the system which has been built, designed almost to be unstable. So this is where capitalism has led us, and the austerity measures of the last 10, 12 years, both in Europe and UK. So one can see that people's incomes have reduced, whilst the profits have increased, because that's what capitalism does, is that the 1% of the population reap all the benefits, while the 99% do not get any benefit of that profit that is being raked in. And we've seen over the last 3 years during the pandemic how the profits have soared of the large multinational corporations, whilst their employees have been exploited in a most extraordinary manner. Companies like Amazon and Microsoft and other sort of big operators have seen their profits double and triple on many occasions. While, like in the United Kingdom, nurses' salaries have actually reduced by 25% the purchasing power of what they were earning 10, 12 years ago. The junior doctors in the health service have had their pay cut in real terms. And across the board, whether it's workers, in teachers, railway workers, that's why you've had strikes in London in many, many areas of activity. Similarly, in France, it's the first time that all the unions have come together to oppose this particular increase in pension age. Germany has seen strikes. Holland, Italy, Spain, the days that have been lost due to strike have been quite incredible in the last year, and which has continued in 2023.
Thank you very much for pointing that out. Capitalism itself as an underlying cause, that mentality and the economics that is based on that. So, Mr. Bosnitch, in your opinion, how much is capitalism to blame, and how much is the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine taking a toll on Europe's economy?
Well, in fact, they're one and the same. The Western incursion into Ukraine by providing weapons to their puppet President Zelensky is actually grand theft country, which is a big step up from grand theft auto. The Western regimes have seen the opportunity to advance their attempted takeover of Eurasia by advancing into the soft underbelly of Russia in the form of Ukraine. They've been playing around there since 1990, when Ukraine was just entering its period of independence. And these are the results. These are the ways in which they operate. The economic fallout, however, is that they have to take whatever free cash they normally float around in their own economies to pump weapons into their puppet regime in Kiev. And that shortens the cash supply, and it makes it hard for people to survive in the West. The prices go up, the energy supply is constrained, and people have to work longer for less money. And that's where the French especially have seen their government betray them, lie to them, and steal from them by canceling their pensions, by clawing back their invested pension fund monies, and forcing them to work on a post-retirement basis because their government is incompetent and because it's committing war crimes.
And let's add to that, Mr. Bosnitch, that everywhere in Europe, the ruling class is claiming that they cannot make any concessions while they are funding bank bailouts and vast military budgets to fuel the war that NATO is waging against Russia and Ukraine. How far do you think this can go, Mr. Bosnitch?
Oh, well, we know that President de Gaulle was ousted by street protests in 1968. And that means, and I can tell you, President Macron is not a slim shadow of President de Gaulle. So President Macron could fall at any moment. It's just a question of whether he can maintain support in his party and support in the National Assembly of France. And once again, it's all just a question of money, because everybody in this game is corrupt. People are not going into politics anymore because they're idealists. People are going into politics because it's the shortest trajectory to maximum wealth, pickpocketed from the public. And the public in France is one of the most enlightened and most socially conscious and democratically active publics in all of Europe. Where the French go, the Europeans will follow.
So, Mr. Razvi, do you agree with that?
Well, look, obviously there's immense truth in what our friend from Belgrade is talking about. The reality is that, the benefit of capitalism, as I said, really are equitably distributed. And what happens is that wealth tends to accrue to a small percentage of the population, which has been sort of shown in the last few decades is that 1% of the population. But what happens with capitalism is that it is inherently exploitative, alienating, unstable, unsustainable, and creates massive economic inequality. It commodifies people. People are seen as a commodity, how much they can sort of produce for the organization. And it is anti-democratic and leads to an erosion of human rights and national sovereignty, while it incentivizes imperialist expansion and war. Like our colleague was saying, that expansion and war in Ukraine, and we've seen what America has done since the Second World War, at least has fought in 50 different nations. It has 750 sort of bases abroad, while the ordinary people in America are suffering. A nation like America, where 50 million people have no healthcare provision, really shows you what capitalism does. And you can take another example, if you like, Philippines, which has been under the control of the Americans for the last 150 years after Spain sort of left that. Philippines hasn't progressed at all in any shape or form, while other countries in the Far East, Malaysia, Indonesia, are doing a lot better than Malaysia. So anyone who has been following the neoliberal capitalist model, or whichever nation has tried that, has actually failed immensely. The economists who sort of the purveyors of neoliberal economic model will always argue that it is capitalism which has uplifted the ordinary people from the poverty trap. But the reality is that capitalism applies sanctions on countries whereby a social model is being followed. And when they fail, we are told that a socially conscious economic model cannot operate. But the reality is that happens due to the manner in which capitalism and the neoliberal rulers in London, Paris, and Washington try to sort of destroy nations.
So, Mr. Bosnitch, in your opinion, well, Britain has found itself gripped with the worst cost of living crisis in decades. The inflation is at a 41-year high, and food and energy bills have skyrocketed in the last few months, particularly, and millions are struggling to cope. Let's focus more on Britain. Do you think that the Prime Minister there, Rishi Sunak, has any solutions?
Not at all, obviously. He comes from that group in British society that clawed their way up to the top to become one of the shoulder rubbers with the banksters. We're talking about a particular type of capitalism here, which is worse than all of the others combined, and that's called bankster capitalism. That's a combination of gangsters and bankers. Bankster capitalism. And in that sense, it's the maximum possible concentration of wealth in the fewest possible hands, which extrapolates all of the evils of capitalism and multiplies them to their maximum possible extent. England, and specifically the City of London, the banking heart of the English Empire, is one of the main co-conspirators here in this crime. What we're seeing here is a groundswell of human opposition to mechanized theft.
And Mr. Bosnitch, since you mention people a lot whenever we talk, and you actually believe a lot in the power of the people, the right to strike is, of course, a cornerstone of democracy and a fundamental right under the European Social Charter. Yet, for example, in France and also other parts of Europe, we see that these protesters are met with excessive force by police. How do you think that explains the democracy that Europe has been standing for over the past decades, lecturing the entire world about what democracy should be?
Well, France, unfortunately, is now led by a man who is nothing more than another poodle like Tony Blair was in England, working for the Anglo-American empire centered in Washington. Macron is an American project. He's a marionette leader of France, and better than anybody else, the people, as I use those terms, the people of France know that. They elected him because they were the victims of a massive wave of propaganda against the National Front, which was the leading opposition party to Macron, and now they've got what they voted for, and they're starting to realize what a terrible, terrible option they took.
Exactly. So let's bring in Mr. Razvi. I hope that we have enough time to finish this discussion. Mr. Razvi, in your opinion, these protesters are being met with excessive force. What does that mean? And do you see the will in Europe to solve the economic woes, to alleviate these economic woes?
Well, look, there's never enough time to discuss these issues. And thank you very much for the time that you have allocated. Look, the situation in Europe is becoming quite exasperating. And all across Europe, because, Europe, as being part of NATO, has sort of really focused on its military power and has spent money on armaments and so on, while infrastructure is not developed. Okay, Europe is a lot better on healthcare issue compared to USA, as I was talking about, but then nonetheless, the exploitation that is taking place of the working class in the whole of Europe is really quite phenomenal. And it has really, as I said earlier, taken speed. It has been more quicker in pace over the last 3 years during the pandemic, when the huge sort of corruptive nature of contracts that were given in the United Kingdom, in Germany, in Holland, in France, all to do with sort of pandemic-related projects. which was sort of exploited by the friends of the ruling elite. So money is siphoned out of the system by the elite and their friends, whilst they often tell us that there isn't money to be spent on the salaries and wages for people to sort of live a reasonable life. And again, the neoliberal economists sort of always argue that it becomes the sort of wages inflation spiral. But the reality is that over the last 10 years, we've seen that more money has been printed, and due to that, asset pricing has increased, i.e., the sort of stock market valuations, real estate, all that has increased because there was cheap money available. But as soon as one talks about paying the nurses, the teachers, the doctors, the railway workers, the people who actually run the nation, there is no money, we are told quite often. But when there are bailouts and all kinds of shenanigans that go on in the sort of financial market are really awarded, while ordinary people are penalized.
Okay, so Mr. Bosnitch, we have 1 minute to wrap this whole discussion up. If you could conclude our discussion tonight with a few sentences, that would be great.
All right. Well, look, it's an excellent thing that these demonstrations are being led by the people of France. The French see the system as being a military protection racket in which people are forced to pay for weapons for wars they don't want. And actually, it's a good time to remember that President de Gaulle came to Canada when the Quebec separatists in Canada wanted to have more freedom, and he called for Vive la Québec libre, le Québec libre. Well, what we need to say today is long live a free France, vive la France libre. And that's what the people of France are going to achieve.
Thank you very much, Mr. John Bosnitch, journalist, activist, and political analyst, joining us live from Belgrade. Also, Mr. Shabbir Razvi, economic and political analyst, joining us live from London. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and views with us on this edition of Spotlight. And thanks to all of you viewers for watching this edition.